to the last evening plenary of SURF 2016. So over the last 2 days, we have shared and reflected on past and current ISLA research. We have engaged in rich discussions about the future of ISLA research. And we have found out how to navigate through Teachers College without getting lost. The last few days have been a celebration of over 3 decades of scholarship in this immensely significant domain of second language acquisition. We hope that the questions and thoughts that we have shared together have inspired and encouraged you in your journey through this fascinating realm of second language acquisition. And it was truly exciting to be part of the energy and enthusiasm that all of our presenters and attendees brought to this forum. So we hope that you enjoyed SURF 2016. We hope that you enjoyed your time here at Teachers College and your stay in New York City. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future SLURF. But speaking of a future SLURF, we wanted to let you know that the application process of hosting SLURF 2017 is still open until November 30th. So if your university would like to host SLURF next year, please check out our website for more information about the proposal process, and you can send us an email. Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, as Sarah said, thank you all for coming to this conference. We've all had a great time with the presentations and learned a lot. But before we say our final goodbyes, we have one more plenary session that we have all been looking forward to, and the subsequent roundtable moderated by Dr. Susan Gass. So right now, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Gass from the University of Michigan, Michigan State University. Yes, absolutely. From Michigan State University, I know that a lot of you here, where she directs the Second Language Studies PhD program and the ELC. She has published widely in the field of second language acquisition and has served as president of AAAL and AILA. Ladies and gentlemen, we present to you Professor Susan Gass.
Okay, thank you. And yes, I am from Michigan State, not the other one, a little bit to the south of us. As I started thinking about what I wanted to say about Mike, and I thought about what do you say about someone who really needs no introduction, I thought I would ask my very good friend Allison Mackey if she had any hints about what to say. And, you know, I thought, really, he's a household word. What else can I add? So Allison said that quite a while ago, I don't know if you remember this, Mike, but you gave a talk at Georgetown, and she was so intimidated by having to introduce Mike that she just lost all of her words, and she said, "And this is Mike Long," and then she sat down. So that didn't help me much. But then I Googled Mike to see what I could find out about him, and I found out that Mike Long is a former Australian rules footballer and spokesperson for Indigenous rights and against racism in sport. Now, had they said soccer player instead of Australian rules footballer, maybe I might have thought that this was our very own Mike Long, but it wasn't. But he certainly has so many accomplishments that he doesn't have to be an Australian rules footballer. He's currently, as you know, a professor of SLA at the University of Maryland, but his path to that position is not a normal one. He received a degree, a bachelor's of law as his first degree from the University of Birmingham, and that's probably why his argumentation is so solid and so good. He's had a long list of visiting appointments around the world. He's taught at so many places, including in Japan and Australia, Spain, China, even Teachers College at Columbia I found out, and even at my own Michigan State University when we had a TESOL Summer Institute back many years ago. And this is only a few of his accomplishments, and if that weren't enough, we find out that he has 16 books which he's authored or edited to his credit. And if that weren't enough, he has more than 55 articles in books. And if that weren't enough, he has more than 40 refereed articles. And if that weren't enough, he has served on some of the editorial boards of the most prominent journals in the field. And if that weren't enough to convince you that you are in for a treat, I point out that he has been an invited speaker at more than 70 national and international conferences. Mike's talks are always filled with juicy bits of insightfulness and wisdom, and even sometimes controversy. So at this point, I invite you to sit back, fasten your seatbelts, relax, and enjoy this trip through methodology and instructed ISLA, and be sure to put your phones in airplane mode. And I, like Allison, am in awe of all of his accomplishments, and I will just say, this is Mike Long, and I'm going to sit down.
Thanks very much, Sue, and thank you to the Student Organizing Committee and Professor Hahn for inviting me. And I would like, I think on behalf of all of us, to thank Natalia Saiz and Sarah Stock, who are the co-chairs, as well as all the many volunteers for putting on such a well-organized event. Could I ask you to show us? The one thing that was erroneous in what was said is that most of us have yet to find our way around these buildings. And when I stopped a security guard this morning and asked him, I was going completely the wrong direction, he said that when he started work here a few years ago, he was given a walkie-talkie, and for 5 days he was trained just to find his way around these buildings. So we've done pretty well to get here. So this presentation is in two parts. In the first part, I will begin by identifying some outside forces external to the field, which are, I think, driving the quantity of work in ISLA, and are likely to do so for the foreseeable future. I will then note 5, I was originally going to do 6, but just because of time, 5 developments inside the field that are producing improvements in both the quantity and the quality of research. In the second part, I will begin with a brief discussion of 3 constraints on the design of any type of instruction, and then discuss 3 learning conditions I consider it crucial for research on ISLA to compare in order to resolve some long-standing debates about language teaching. I will illustrate how the 3 conditions would motivate studies of one issue, resetting L1 parameters and dealing with blocking. If there is sufficient interest and enough masochists in the audience who stay on, I can illustrate also with a second area, which is instance learning of lexical items and collocations, but I'll understand quite well if there's nobody else here, and just stick with the first, up to you. So first, some external motivators of ISLA research. If you look at the evening news, wherever you live, you'll know pretty much what we're starting off with. The first thing is there are these powerful geopolitical forces at work increasing hugely the number of foreign language and second language learners and second dialect learners in several groups. Most obviously at the moment we have refugees who are fleeing war zones, drought, famine, ethnic cleansing, poverty, disease and climate change, which of course are giving rise to a need for German and Swedish as a second language for speakers of Arabic, Pashto, and Dari, and so on. We have migrant workers and their children. In this country, for example, they're a huge group. But it's not just here. In Japan, you have Tagalog-speaking healthcare workers being imported in large numbers. So you have a need for JSL for Tagalog L1 speakers. Here we've got ESL for Spanish-speaking construction workers and many other types of migrant workers. We have school-aged children, speakers of minority languages or dialects who have to be educated through the medium of a foreign language, for example in CLIL programs, content and language integrated programs. Second languages, for example the children of Spanish-speaking migrants to this country who go to school in some kind of English or bilingual program. And you have speakers of minority dialects who are forced to take their education through the medium of a more quote-unquote standard dialect. We have diplomats, missionaries, aid workers, international volunteers, Peace Corps for example, and vast and ever-increasing numbers of international students. All of these people often start with a foreign language in their home country, but eventually need that same language as a second language when they go to the university in the other country. We also have learners of L2s in multilingual societies, for example French for Flemish speakers in Belgium and vice versa, or of L2s that serve as lingua francas in their home countries, for example English or French in several parts of Africa, and sometimes also as both lingua franca and national languages, for example Urdu in Pakistan. And last but by no means least, there's this huge group of native speakers of languages like Dutch, Polish, Turkish or Finnish with limited reach outside their home country, many of whom choose English as a medium of wider communication, but also other L2s. With the case of English, there are approximately 400 million native speakers of English in the world today, but approximately 1.6 billion non-native speakers, so 4 times as many. And there are obviously hundreds of millions of L2 speakers of other languages too, but although I Googled around, I couldn't come up with nice little lists of those. All in all, there are assuredly more L2 learners today than ever, and it's only going to go on like this, particularly because of things like climate change and the big geopolitical forces. That is all by way of saying how important foreign and second language learning is and how many people are affected by it. I think often teachers, funnily enough, don't realize the importance of what they do, and they could use these kinds of numbers to impress school boards and so forth. But as a field, there is a connection, sometimes tenuous, but in a few cases I'll mention in a moment, quite clear, between the numbers of speakers and the amount of ISLA research that goes on as a result. As I say, it's sometimes tenuous, but there are some clear cases. Sometimes the relationship is indirect and non-existent, but in some cases not so. For example, increasing numbers of parents and governments in many countries recognize the importance of a high-level functional command of one or more foreign languages. This has led to the lowering in many countries of the age at which foreign languages are introduced in schools, and also to the rapid spread of immersion and CLIL programs, among others. Those changes have prompted nationally and internationally funded research on the short and long-term effects of earlier versus later first exposure, for example in Spain, lots of studies of that, and on the absolute and relative effectiveness of different types of content programs taught through the medium of an L2. For example, some of the CLIL research that's going on. So those are some of the external forces that are increasing the numbers of learners and, indirectly at least, the amount of research in this area. Then there are internal motivators of ISLA research. Whereas the external forces were mostly focusing on increasing the quantity, these internal factors that I'm going to come to now increase both quantity and quality. Most of them concern methodological improvements. They also have an effect on quality, as do some of the others indirectly, but this is more direct, as you'll see in a moment. In my opinion, at least 5 developments are already having or will have a very positive effect on ISLA research, although I have a few minor reservations about 1 or 2 of them. The first is these detailed state-of-the-science surveys, both narrative accounts and statistical meta-analysis. You can hardly open a journal these days without seeing a statistical meta-analysis of something, and I want to start by saying I think this is a huge benefit to the field, so that in a moment when I mention a few misgivings I have about it, please remember that overall I think it's a highly positive development. So a major source of improvement in research on ISLA has been the appearance of more and more sophisticated research syntheses, both narrative reviews and statistical meta-analysis. The work of John Norris, Lourdes Ortega, Sue Gass, and Luke Plonsky has been of particular importance for statistical meta-analyses. Their strengths are well known. They are more systematic, objective, exhaustive, and transparent than narrative reviews, and because sample sizes and effect sizes are weighted, they produce conclusions that are less vulnerable to individual, potentially misleading sets of results, or the rhetorical skills of particular commentators. Their strengths notwithstanding, it is worth remembering that there are bad statistical meta-analysis just as there are bad narrative reviews. Poor examples of the application of any research method does not mean the method itself is poor, of course, but statistical meta-analysis, it seems to me, can be unusually vulnerable to two quality control issues: content expertise and what I call the apples and oranges problem. So content expertise. If there is insufficient familiarity with the history of work on a topic and with earlier methodological deconstructions of flawed studies, combined with the wish to include all studies, it may lead to results from poor work being accorded the same weight as those from well-conducted research if the statistical data they provide justify their inclusion in the sample. So I have thought for a while that it would be better if meta-analysis only included studies that passed muster methodologically and then calculated effect sizes for those. It's very important, therefore, when good meta-analysis take the precautions that exist for dealing with this issue. For example, by operationalizing factors like study quality, primary study context, and other moderating variables in an attempt to model and understanding their effects. So I'm not saying that statistical meta-analysis can't deal with these issues, I'm just saying that occasionally they don't, and that then the desire to be all-inclusive, to sweep up, hoover up all the studies, can actually mean that bad and good are given the same weight, provided they meet the minimal statistical data to be included. The apples and oranges problem is a question of averaging effect sizes across non-comparable populations and settings. This is counterproductive. An example would be if there were a statistical meta-analysis that mixed the results on age effects with school-aged children in classroom foreign language settings, which at most speak only to rate of progress in the early stages of language learning, with those on ultimate attainment from studies of long-term naturalistic SLA by children and adults. These are weaknesses of poor statistical meta-analyses, not of statistical meta-analysis itself, the arrival of which, I repeat, I think has already had a very positive effect on the field, and if you're not aware of it yet, Luke Plonsky is offering a workshop on statistical meta-analysis tomorrow morning as part of this conference. Second improvement, deployment of new technology. Several types of new Maryland students will be laughing now to hear me talking about new technology, but several types of new technology have been deployed in ISLA studies in recent years, especially online procedures that provide more direct windows on real-time processing than such methods as think-aloud protocol stimulated recall, which are indirect and can also distort the language learning task itself. Leo Roberts, in an article in SLR in 2012, provides a valuable overview of psycholinguistic measures from types and functions to prices of hardware and software options. The increased use of online measures in part both reflects and facilitates the long-standing but now rapidly growing interest in comparisons of explicit and implicit processes in language learning. And there's been much in evidence at this conference, lots of papers in that area. Examples of new technology deployed in ISLA research, some newer than others, outside and inside our field: reaction times, eye tracking, pupillometry, EEG and ERP, and more. These procedures allow observation of online language learning processes such as attention, detection, and noticing that constitute important constructs in many current theories, but have previously remained inaccessible to researchers or observable only indirectly. Just to illustrate with one of them, eye tracking, which again has been all over this conference. Eye tracking in particular has already had a major impact on our understanding of ISLA. The team at Michigan State, led by Sue Gass, Aline Godfroid, and I asked her because it's a French name, but we know that she came up through the Flemish system and has a Flemish accent. I asked her, and that's how it's done. I don't know if she's here, but it's Godfroid. So it's a mix of Flemish and French pronunciation. I'm probably murdering it, but I at least tried. So data on, so the team at Michigan State, Sue Gass, Alina Godfroid, and Paula Winke has been especially influential. Data on eye movement provide a window in real time on such matters as the incidental learning of vocabulary and collocations while reading, and without the potential reactivity of underlining, think aloud, or stimulated recall. The strengths of eye tracking are laid out succinctly by Godfroid, Winke and Gass, and Keating, 2014, among others. The online study of language processing that eye tracking permits means that researchers can record not just whether learners attend to linguistic features of interest, but underlining the old behavioral methods for how long they do so, gaze fixation, among other things. This simple but important difference allowed Godfroid, Boers, and Housen to document a direct relationship between the amount of attention paid to new words while reading and the learning of those words, and Pellicer-Sanchez to do the same with reading times. The data on locus and duration of gaze fixation can be related to uptake more generally. Eye movement and gaze fixation records are immediate and permanent, not subject to decay or loss, as can happen when traditional procedures, such as stimulated recall, are used to measure them after the fact. This is especially valuable in studies of attention and noticing. The alternative, use of a post-treatment behavioral measure of learning as the means by which to infer whether noticing occurred, can easily lead to the conclusion that a treatment was ineffective in stimulating noticing because no measurable learning is recorded, when in reality, as shown in a study of textual enhancement by Paula Winke, it may be that noticing of non-salient forms did occur, but the memory trace that could have provided evidence of learning had decayed before the post-tests came around. Moreover, triangulating the first two data points, attention and uptake, with a third, awareness of whatever has been learned, e.g. from consecutive verbal reports, as in stimulated recall, makes it possible to test rival claims to the effect that noticing at the level of awareness is necessary for acquisition, as postulated by Dick Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, or that noticing at the level of attention to input, i.e. detection, is sufficient, as claimed by Tomlin and Villa. This is an issue to which I will return in the second half. Third development is the creation and validation of new measures. The appearance of new instruments and measures usually goes hand in hand with conceptual advances. For reasons of time, I will illustrate with just one today, a new measure of language aptitude. Understandings of the role of aptitude in ISLA are still largely influenced by the constructs underlying measures developed 50 years ago without insights from theory and research in modern SLA and psycholinguistics. Instruments such as the MLAT, for example, Modern Language Aptitude Test, were heavily weighted towards aptitude for analytic, explicit language learning. It's no surprise, therefore, that moderate to high correlations were achieved and continue to be achieved between scores on such measures and scores on tests of foreign language abilities learned and measured in the same way. The tests are still good at predicting rate of progress in the early stages of foreign languages taught explicitly. But what about success at later stages, or when very advanced proficiency is the goal, or for learners with higher aptitude for implicit language learning, or learners taught using some form of communicative methodology? Hi-LAB, and I refer you to articles by Kathy Doughty in 2013 and by Jared Linck, 2013, developed at the University of Maryland, no conflict here, is a very different kind of measure. Its main purpose is to identify individuals with the capacity to achieve very advanced proficiency in a foreign language, which is to say, it is less concerned with the early rate of learning and more with long-term attainment. Reflecting modern theory and research findings in SLA and psycholinguistics, roughly half of Hi-LAB's battery of subtests are devoted to measuring aptitude for implicit learning, and especially in predicting success in learning critical so-called Category 4 languages, such as Mandarin, Russian, Korean, or Arabic, which are notoriously difficult for adult native speakers of English, and learning them to very advanced levels. The Hi-LAB subtests of implicit learning, associative learning, and working memory have been shown capable of identifying exceptional learners, even among pools of candidates, all of whom are good at foreign languages. With its combination of predominantly domain-general, implicitly oriented subtests and some analytically oriented ones, Hi-LAB provides teachers and the learners themselves with detailed user-friendly profiles of their relative strengths and weaknesses for implicit and explicit language learning. Those of you who went to the Doughty et al. Study yesterday morning, you'll have seen examples of these profiles, what the teachers and students are given. The aptitude profiles are already being used to match learners exhibiting particular aptitude profiles with instruction designed for those profiles, so-called tailored language training. Tare et al. And the Doughty et al. Paper yesterday report on early studies which are showing the effectiveness of matching learners to particular kinds of instruction according to their profile, their aptitude profiles. But I think it goes further than that. Hi-LAB will also be useful for aptitude treatment interaction research on ISLA. Look at the chapter by Karen Batts et al. For example, a large study currently nearing completion by Yücel Yilmaz and Gisela Granena has been using Hi-LAB and the Llama subtests to investigate the relative effectiveness of different kinds of negative feedback for learners with different language aptitudes. Yücel and Gisela are finding that different cognitive abilities predict learning outcomes, GJT scores and oral production, differently as a result of two treatments, recasts and explicit correction. In the recast group, for example, there are significant positive correlations with scores on 3 implicit measures, Hi-LAB serial reaction time and processing speed tests, and Llama-D, which is sound recognition, and a significant negative correlation with an explicit measure, Llama-F, which is grammatical inferencing. In the explicit correction group, conversely, there are significant negative correlations with task switching, serial reaction time, and approaching significance, processing speed. Finally, I think Hi-LAB may also radically change understandings of aptitude in basic research on age differences, maturational constraints, and sensitive periods in SLA, where more traditional notions of aptitude have already featured for some time as an important moderator variable, for example, in my colleague Robert de Keyser's work. And for an excellent overview of those interactions, please see the terrific review article by Granena, 2016, in the new Brill Journal. I think it is safe to predict that in 10 years' time, the role of language aptitude in SLA in general, and ISLA in particular, will be recognized as differentially important for learners with different aptitude profiles, and more important overall than is the case today, and Hi-LAB will have played a major part in the change in thinking. The fourth area inside the field, which I think is improving both quantity and quality, is, I could have summarized this as just collaboration of different kinds. The first example is the proposal that a group of us made at the TBLT conference at Leuven last year to set up a collaborative research network, which are common in more mature sciences, for work on task complexity, because a statistical meta-analysis by John Norris, Shoko Sasayama, and I think it's Selective, I remember, had shown that after literally about 200 studies, we're not exactly none the wiser, but we're not much wiser. Why is that? Because researchers working in isolation around the world, even though they're investigating the same topic, are using as many as 70 different measures for the dependent, the outcome variables. They're using different tasks, different populations, different measures, different treatments, different outcome measures. It's no wonder that the things are not cumulative. So if you look at, there was an article in Nature 2 years ago talking about the level of these collaborative research networks in physics, astronomy, medicine, and so forth. Articles are now increasingly frequently published in those journals with as many as hundreds of co-authors. If you think about it, when the Americans put a satellite on a moving comet a year or so ago, an incredible achievement, that involved the work of hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists. I mean, you can't just get up one morning and say, we're going to launch, from my backyard. You've got to have physicists, mathematicians, metals engineers, people who know all about the strengths of all sorts of things. And of course, they all get credit when the articles come out. The advantage, though, is not limited to fields like astronomy and physics and medicine. It's becoming increasingly common in the social sciences, and there's a little bit of it in our field because you see more and more articles with 4 or 5 co-authors. The point, though, is it's not just something that's done because funding is limited. It's actually a positive thing because you can pool resources, you can make studies cumulative, because if there is a collaborative research network, the idea is to negotiate the exact design of the study, the exact measures, and get this insights, this expertise from an international group before you go and do all the heavy lifting of collecting data. So collaborative research networks, I think, offer a number of advantages. But I have to say that although there was a lot of enthusiasm when we proposed this in Leuven, and a lot of people signed up right away and so forth, it's taking us longer than we expected to get the thing up and running and open for public. I mean, there's an inside group that's already working together, but the idea is this is public access eventually, and University of Barcelona is going to host the website for the group. For the CRN. I anticipate there'll be CRNs in many other topics. This is the first one that I know of in our field. However, at this conference, Kara Morgan-Short and Marsden presented this multi-site replication study that they had achieved simply by posting online, asking for people who are interested and willing to replicate the same study, which was a replication of a Liao study, which was a replication of a Van Patten study. And she got, to my surprise, she got 5, 6, 7 campuses, and of course the results are much stronger for that. That's an example of collaboration. It's a bit different from a CRN in the sense that with a CRN, the researchers are grouped at the outset according to some common area of interest. It could be maturational constraints, it could be task complexity, it could be anything really. And then they go ahead collectively to design the studies, work out a research agenda, a series of studies, not just one-off studies, before they actually do any of the data collection. Whereas in the case of Kara Morgan-Short and Marsden, as I understand it, they said, we want to do this study, who wants in? And they got a lot of takers. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think their experience is going to be very useful to our CRN because of some of the logistical issues that I had an opportunity to hear the two of them talk about before the paper yesterday. But it's not just that area of collaboration that's happening. You have IRIS, which most of you are familiar with by now. That Instruments for Research into Second Language Learning, a digital repository, with Emma Marsden, Alison Mackey, and Luke Plonsky leading the way. I mean, this is a terrific help. I mean, for graduate students, instead of having to reinvent the wheel every time and show that their instruments work and so on and so forth, they still have to do reliability when they use them for their populations. But still, the heavy lifting has been done. The instruments have been shown to work in published studies and so forth. And it's now, I learned this morning at the ISLA board meeting, that in fact data are now going to be included in IRIS, and I hadn't realized that. So it's really becoming a very big growth industry with, I think, hugely positive results, especially for graduate students who are working in isolation, and a lot of people are. I'm sure a lot of you have your inboxes full, as I do every day, not full, but 1 or 2 requests from, won't name the countries, saying, dear Professor Long, I'm going to do for my PhD dissertation a study of, fill in the blank, recast or something like that. Unfortunately, at our university, there are no books on this in the library, and I don't have access to journals, and there are no professors here who are interested in this topic. Could you therefore, and I actually kept some of these, and so do other people I'm in touch with about this, could you please send me, and then you've got A, all the work you have ever published on this topic, it gets worse, or B, all the work that has been published on this topic. I would be eternally grateful, etc., God be with you, and off we go. Well, IRIS, I think, I will just start directing them to IRIS, and of course nobody can handle all this stuff. It's difficult enough to keep up with one's own students, let alone all these people everywhere. And there are several of us now who are keeping some of these pearls of emails that come through. It's sad in a way. It's not really fun to laugh at these people because they're in trouble. But what I'm saying is that the collaboration of a CRN where they can access the stuff on a particular topic, or IRIS where they can go and get all sorts of help, are, I think, going to improve work in the field. And there is now a book which Emma and Alison have edited together. Yeah, there it is, Mackey and Marsden 2016. Did we put that up? Yes, we did. Good. So, collaboration of various kinds. Also, the amount of replication. Graham Port's devoted a lot of effort to this, and particularly has devoted space in his journal, Language Teaching. SSLA had that kind of space devoted to replication studies many years ago, and now is an official policy that the new editors, Sue Gass and Bill Van Patten, have instituted, is to devote space for replications. Again, this is all of these things I think are clearly improving and are likely to go on improving the quality as well as the quantity of work in the field. Last but not least, there's increased journal and conference space for the dissemination of the findings. Remember, research doesn't really exist until you put it out there so that people can read it. So we have, I think, increasing numbers of ISLA studies are showing up in journals in related or neighboring disciplines, things like bilingualism, language and cognition, applied psycholinguistics, and so forth, and at the equivalent conferences. In 1997, language teaching research was established, exclusively focused on some ISLA and some language teaching research, and so for the most part is language teaching. There's a new journal, Brill Research Perspectives in Multilingualism Second Language Acquisition, which will feature some ISLA research. And in 2017, so next year, we will see the first issue of another brand new international journal from Equinox. It's going to be 2 issues a year, and the title is Instructed Second Language Acquisition. So the whole focus of that journal is going to be on ISLA studies, edited by Alessandro Benatti and Elena Nuzzo. It's got an international editorial board. And I know that Alessandro has left flyers for the journal, if anybody is interested, on a chair. Oh, I'm sorry about this. Can you hear me if it's over there? Not so well, okay. On a chair right outside the door. So please pick one up if you're interested. And there's also a website already for the journal. ISLA is up and running. So these developments I've touched on are just some of the internal forces driving conceptual and methodological improvements in ISLA research, increasing quantity and quality. There are others, but also several continuing problems which everyone mentions but about which little is done, such as the shortage of longitudinal studies, the use of time series designs, and so on. In part 2 of this presentation, I now turn to major research issues in ISLA, and especially to one I see as central to many long-running debates on ISLA and language teaching. What can best be achieved, or achieved at all, through incidental and/or intentional language learning? In chapter 3 of a book I published last year, SLA and TBLT, I outlined the cognitive interactionist theory of instructed SLA. There is no time to go through the whole theory today, you will be relieved to hear. Just a simplified 3-minute synopsis of one section, plus some minimally adequate working definitions of a few key terms. Monolingual adults are partially disabled second language learners in at least 2 closely related ways. First, they have paid a heavy price for learning their native language so well. Successful child first language acquisition involved implicit processing mechanisms becoming optimized for the L1, a process Cutler calls developmental sharpening, which means they are no longer tuned appropriately for a new language later on. For example, the speech perception mechanisms that at birth were capable of handling any phonology the infant encountered were subsequently shaped by the L1 experience and set for just those phonetic contrasts, rhythm, and prosodic patterns relevant in the native language, for review see Doughty 2003. The same is true of grammar, semantics, and pragmatics. The L1 tuned processing systems work against the adult L2 learner when they are applied to a new language whose parameters differ. They lead to adults adversely filtering L2 input to L1 established attractors and blocking a focus on new ones, referred to in the literature as learned attention. For details, see Nick Ellis, who's been writing about this for at least a decade. Second, the capacity for implicit learning, learning without intention or awareness of what is being learned, which takes care of most first language acquisition by children, begins to weaken noticeably, not disappear, but weaken by age 12. Javisek, Fizer, and Nemeth, for example. The capacity for explicit probabilistic sequence learning appears to increase around the same age. The decline in the capacity for implicit learning is due especially to an age-related deterioration in the efficiency of instance learning. In this case, the ability to pick up, incidentally, the thousands of arbitrary form-meaning associations a language contains. Vocabulary and collocations are prime examples. Adults are especially disadvantaged by the interaction of the implicit learning disability with the L1 disability. Nick Ellis, that is, has pointed out that unless reset by some form of intervention, of which more in a minute, implicit processing tuned by and for the native language will filter the L2 through the L1 grid, tending to diminish the size and importance of some differences that are perceived and missing others altogether. The same thing can happen within the L2. Once certain cues have been associated with specific meanings or functions, learned attention, diverting learners' attention to new cues for the same things becomes harder, especially when the first set are communicatively successful, perceptually more salient, and render the less salient ones communicatively redundant. An example is past time reference in English as a second language. Starting with Charlie Sato's longitudinal study of 2 Vietnamese children's naturalistic acquisition of English, Sato 86 and 90, and Jürgen Meisel's parallel findings for L2 German, Meisel 87, a series of researchers have reported learners' preference for adverbs before inflectional morphology, and interlocutor scaffolding before the adverbs too, as the preferred ways of marking past time reference. So you get things like yesterday he played rather than he played. Sato noted that adding the morphological option is especially problematic when an open syllable L1, such as Vietnamese, makes use of the L2 form difficult, because the L2 morphology requires closed syllables and production of word final consonants or consonant clusters, things like liked and walked. The first cue, adverbials, blocks attention to the new one, inflectional morphology. An important function of instruction is to circumvent such blocking and thereby facilitate the learning of new associations. For example, less salient bound verbal morphology instead of adverbials to express past time reference. Input processing instruction, see Benati's book 2013 and of course Bill Van Patten's articles, is designed in part precisely to prevent L1 cues, for example that the first noun phrase in an English utterance is the agent, from blocking correct interpretations of the same cues in an L2 with flexible word order like Spanish, where the first NP can often be the object. And there was a very nice study this afternoon by Isa and Karen Morgan-Short on that issue using eye tracking as well. A lot more could be said about these issues, of course, but this will have to suffice for now to explain the crux of the learning problem. The question is what to do about it. What kind of instruction can help, and what sort of ISLA research can find out? There are many long-running disagreements in the language teaching literature, some going back centuries, see Musumechi's book. Some are conducted at the level of methodological principle, for example, whether negative feedback should be provided at all. Others at the level of pedagogic procedure, for example, different ways of providing negative feedback. Perhaps the biggest disagreements concern the importance of the time from 0 to 100% that should be devoted to a focus on the L2 as object, for example, using a synthetic grammatical syllabus and PPP, or the L2 as a medium of communication, for example, using an analytic procedural syllabus or an immersion, CLIL, or the natural approach, or 3, a combination of the two, for example, some variety of communicative language teaching. Many lines of ISLA research are relevant to these debates, but perhaps none more so than, and none more fundamentally so, than work on the roles of incidental and intentional and implicit and explicit learning. First, however, when adopting any position on these and other questions, or on any questions about optimal ISLA programs, it is important to recognize that the designer does not have a free hand. 3 constraints on instruction of any kind need to be borne in mind. The first of these is that the learning task is just too large for either explicit or implicit learning alone. The first constraint when designing instruction is this: the sheer size of the language learning tasks makes either process alone inadequate. Take vocabulary and collocations. Thanks to the work of a number of research centers, but especially Victoria University of Wellington, we now know a lot about vocabulary, the size of the task, about how to assess it, a little bit less about how to do anything about it, about the teaching of it. There's an excellent review article in Aral 2012 by Frank Boers and Lindstromberg, and there's another one by Nation and Webb in 2011. For non-native speakers, it is estimated, this is Paul Nation's work, it is estimated that approximately 9,000 word families, not words, plus proper nouns are required for unassisted reading of newspapers and novels, and approximately 6,000 for watching videos. The immense volume of lexical items precludes any possibility of teaching them all explicitly one by one. There simply isn't time for that in any normal course. Some words or collocations can certainly be taught that way, of course, but learners have to deal with thousands. The same time constraints, especially in foreign language settings, coupled with a lack of sufficient input, makes purely implicit learning from genuine spoken or written text an unviable solution too. So there was an interesting paper this afternoon from a University of Barcelona language acquisition research group on the possibilities of using captioned videos for dealing with this lexical learning problem. Thousands of words in the first 9,000 word families in English simply don't occur in commercially published linguistically simplified readers. For learners to encounter the approximately 12 instances of each new item considered sufficient to learn them through reading unsimplified material, so just novels written for native speakers, for example, or newspapers, Nation 2014 and elsewhere has shown requires a corpus of approximately 3 million words, the equivalent of about 25 novels of 125,000 words each. Nation calculates that the time required for that amount of reading is substantial, after learners reach the 7,000, 8,000, and 9,000 word levels, between 1 and 2 hours of reading per day, 5 days a week. And all this is just about vocabulary. The numbers of collocations learners require is many times higher than the number of lexical items that make them up, as is the time required for learning them through extensive reading and or listening. In short, neither explicit nor implicit learning alone will suffice, especially in foreign language settings, so the solution will have to be something else. The second constraint is that the direct effects of instruction are limited to manipulations of the linguistic environment. The second general constraint is that, with only indirect effects on learning processes, the learner's use of this or that cognitive process can be intended by the instructional designer, but cannot be stipulated or guaranteed. For example, explicit instruction is designed to invoke intentional learning, a conscious operation in which the learner attends to aspects of a stimulus array in the search for underlying patterns or structure. Intentional learning usually results in explicit knowledge. People know something and they know they know. But students may also learn some things incidentally and implicitly from the input used to deliver the implicit instruction. The case of incidental learning is even more complicated. Incidental learning is learning without intention to learn at least part of what is learned, that is, while the learner's attention is focused on something else. If and only if the learner remains unaware of what is learned, the incidental learning process is also a case of implicit learning, resulting in implicit knowledge, that is, learning without intention and without awareness of what has been learned. However, it is often the case that while engaged in incidental learning during work on a communicative task of some kind, watching a movie, reading a story, group problem solving, etc., linguistic forms become the object of focal attention, if only temporarily, as when learners check back in, say, a story they're reading because they get a comprehension question wrong and they want to find out why they got it wrong. Or they may attend to linguistic information contained in corrective recasts, or as a result of teacher-induced focus on form, whereupon learning may briefly become intentional, usually with beneficial results, as shown by research findings on recasts by Gu and Mackey, and on focus on form by Gu, Granena, Novella, and Yilmaz 2016, and Norris and Ortega 2000. Note again, the constraints under which instruction operates, even if the learning process remains incidental and the resulting knowledge begins life as implicit, learners may become aware of what they know either during the learning process in the ways I just mentioned or subsequently, at which point implicit knowledge becomes explicit, or in the case where implicit knowledge is subsequently raised to the level of conscious awareness, somebody asks the learner, why do we do this and not that in English or whatever the language is, it may become doubly represented as both implicit and explicit. In other words, instruction can be designed to create optimal conditions for incidental learning, but that does not guarantee that incidental learning will transpire, or that if it does, the result will be implicit learning, or if it is, that implicit knowledge will be the end product, or if it is, that it will remain implicit only. Despite instruction being subject to the learner's cognitive veto in these ways, all is not lost. Manipulation of the linguistic environment can have significant indirect effects on which processes operate, incidental or intentional, implicit or explicit, on when they operate, and on which classes of target language features. For example, it is possible to determine the type of input to which learners are exposed, genuine, simplified, or elaborated, the input's relevance to their communicative L2 needs, the sequence and perceptual salience of target linguistic features within that input, and crucially, during the L2 exposure, the tasks learners are set. Are they tasks such as dictation, oral pattern practice, or written fill-in-the-blanks exercises that require a focus on language as object and encourage intentional and explicit language learning? Or are they tasks like solving a problem through small group discussion, reading an interesting story, or repairing a bicycle while watching a how-to video on YouTube that encourage a focus on meaning and communication, and in the process, create opportunities for incidental learning? The third constraint, implicit learning, implicit knowledge, is the priority. So whereas nothing can be done about the first two constraints, the third is self-imposed, and perhaps the most controversial. It is that for the great majority of the world's learners, the categories I mentioned at the beginning, who need a functional command of their L2, the relevant goal for instruction is implicit learning, resulting in implicit L2 knowledge. In an article on classroom research in 2014, Wong, Gill, and Marsden noted that while generativists and general cognitivists disagree over the viability of inductive learning as a substitute for innate linguistic knowledge, both camps consider implicit learning more basic and more important than explicit learning, and superior. This is because access to implicit knowledge is automatic and fast. It is what underlies listening comprehension, spontaneous speech, and fluency. It is the result of deeper processing and is more durable as a result. And it obviates the need for explicit knowledge, freeing up attentional resources for a speaker to focus on message. Many, not all members of both camps, Wong et al. Also note, subscribe to some version of the non-interface position. They conclude, quote, "In sum, we argue that the distinction between implicit and explicit knowledge needs to be more robustly recognized in research design, and suggest that implicit knowledge should be the target of research, regardless of theoretical position." I agree. Despite the obstacles created by prior tuning for L1 acquisition, despite the previously noted decrease in power starting in early adolescence of the capacity for implicit learning, especially instance learning, there is plenty of evidence that implicit learning remains a viable option across the lifespan. First, there is evidence from laboratory studies of implicit learning of rules in artificial language grammars and in SLA, for example, ISLA Newport, Rebuschat Williams, and many others, as well as in other complex non-linguistic tasks, Matthews et al. 2000. Second, there is converging evidence from the literature on age effects and maturational constraints on SLA. Studies of ultimate L2 attainment typically compare the ability of child and adult starters to learn hard linguistic constructions or tricky semantic contrasts, such as those between the Spanish preterite and imperfect, Montrul and Slavakova, 2003, or the subtleties of Arabic morphology, Ayub et al. 94, or 9 subtypes of dummy subject constructions in Dutch by adult immigrants to Holland, Van Bokstel and Van Bokstel, Bongerts and Koppen, 2005. While no adult starters have yet been found who have attained native-like abilities, although every time I go to a presentation by Pievi Pietila, I flinch. Because she's awfully close. And she shouldn't be, because she told me again yesterday. She said, funnily enough, she reminded me the first time I heard her give a talk, years ago, I approached her afterwards with the same question with trepidation, you know, how old were you when you were first exposed? 12. She was 12. Is she here? I hope I'm not embarrassing her, but her English is just basically flawless. And I would hope never to have to deal with her as a subject in a lab, because she could be that one case that causes the whole edifice to come crashing down. So while at this point, I should say, no adult starters have yet been found who have attained native-like abilities across the board, see, for example, Abrahamson and Hiltenstein, Long, 2013, researchers have documented exceptional individual cases of adults who have mastered at least one of the kinds of constructions or distinctions I just mentioned. Of those, some at least are almost certain to have been learned implicitly, as they are extremely subtle, and the items are rarely, if ever, taught. The situation is less ambiguous when it comes to collocations. As part of a larger study documenting a series of 3 sensitive periods in the long-term naturalistic acquisition of Spanish phonology, lexis and collocations, and morphology and syntax by 65 Chinese immigrants to Spain, Gisela Granena and I found a statistically significant relationship between aptitude for implicit learning, assessed using LAMA-D, and command of Spanish vocabulary and collocations in the 20 late starters in the sample, whose first exposure coincided with their arrival in Spain between the ages of 16 and 29. Such a relationship is only possible if implicit language learning is still operative for adult learners. So what I'm saying is there's convergent evidence from different types to the existence of the continuing default mechanism of implicit learning across the lifespan. As is obvious from those quotes and the literature cited earlier, as well as from the pioneering experimental work of Nick Ellis, Peter Robinson, John Williams, Patrick Rebuschat, Stefano Rastelli, Wong, Gill, and Marsden, and others, the priority I accord incidental and implicit learning in adults is far from unique, although it is still a minority position in the world of language teaching. The problem, to reiterate, is that while implicit learning remains an option for adults, it requires large amounts of input and consequently more time than is available to most instructed adult learners. As with explicit learning, therefore, not everything can possibly be learned that way, even were there no time constraints. And in fact, it may be that not everything is learnable purely implicitly, even without time constraints. Williams, 2009, in a good review of this issue, concluded that implicit learning appears to work quite well for contingent items, but is temporarily constrained, so that associations between events are only learned if they are either, so if you have, say, long distance anaphora and so on, that's a kind of problem, because they're not, juxtaposed in the input. So that associations between events are only learned if they are either adjacent or brought into adjacency through some other means, by attention or by the use of meaningful context in which they occur. On the other hand, I would say, cases such as that of Julie, described by Ayub et al. Remember, she was the American woman, 20 years in Egypt, no instruction, just emerged from zero. I'm sure I'll still be doing that at the end of this. Remember, she was so good that native speakers of Egyptian colloquial thought she was from other part of Egypt, maybe. Their detailed tests show that, in fact, she did still make errors in certain refined areas of morphology. So again, she wasn't a native speaker, but she was awfully good. When you have cases like that, at least of these long-term residents who do reach very, very high levels, it must be the case that they've learned a lot of this stuff implicitly. The problem is that you need sufficient time and high enough aptitude for implicit language learning, and vanishingly few L2 learners have both. Now I move to, given those three constraints, what I would like to propose is a research agenda for ISLA. Not the only area of research before somebody says, oh, surely you want to also do... No, this is a research agenda for ISLA, which I think is a fundamental one. There are lots of other possible research agendas too, of course. Implicit learning remains the default learning mechanism and implicit knowledge the goal. As we noted earlier, to have any chance of developing implicit knowledge, incidental learning has to be the unmarked instructional condition. However, because of the somewhat reduced power of incidental learning in adults, the large amount of input and time it requires, and especially the adult's weaker capacity for instance learning, there is clearly a need for intervention of some kind. As I see it, there are essentially three options. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. I thought you were going to tell me I had 5 minutes or something, in which case, So, as I see it, there are three basic conditions that are in play. The first is incidental learning plus focus on forms. This is an ugly hybrid, but still has supporters, and the aim is to facilitate noticing, so detection with conscious awareness. This is sort of a Schmidt kind of noticing. The second is incidental learning plus focus on form to facilitate noticing or detection. It can result in either one. And the third is incidental learning plus less intrusive input enhancements to facilitate detection only, not noticing. This is the one I'm going to spend most time on, and the one I think is really the crucial one. Not that it's necessarily going to be the way that languages should be taught, or even can be taught, but we need to find out to what extent they can be. Condition one, focus on what I call focus on forms, uses proactive, explicit instruction to improve on purely incidental learning to induce noticing in Schmidt's sense, i.e. perception with conscious awareness, and I'm going to give you an example of a study of that in a minute. Condition two, focus on form, employs only occasional brief learner-triggered uses of intentional learning in otherwise communicative lessons, with the outcome either conscious noticing or subconscious detection in the sense of Tomlin and Villa. Condition three employs less intrusive enhancements of incidental learning than focus on form, with detection the primary goal. Condition one works, so some of you may have heard recently that focus on form is dead in the water and can mean PPP, it can mean anything. I am going to reply to Rod's article and do it the justice I think it deserves in print in due course. Some people have been saying to me, why didn't you stand up and defend yourself? Well, I couldn't defend myself against 50 charges in 3 seconds from the floor. But just a couple of general things. I mean, Rod is quite correct that the definition of focus on form has, I think his word, it was stretched over the last few years, but not by me. It's been stretched by others, and I take no responsibility for that. So when he talks, and other people do, it's not just Rod doing this, he's accurately reporting the literature. When people talk about preemptive focus on form, that is actually focus on forms. If you start by teaching the language and so that they're going to encounter it in the task, that's not focus on form at all. Focus on form is by definition, as he said yesterday, at least in my work, reactive. Because what we're trying to do is to respond to the learner's internal syllabus, what Pitt Corder drew our attention to. That's why it's reactive. Just because negative feedback, for example, of some kind can be explicit, in a PPP lesson, in a structural syllabus and so forth, does not mean that therefore focus on form goes hand in hand with explicit language teaching. I have always said, and I will be able to come up with the quotes and everything, that the principle, and by the way, it's neither an approach nor a procedure, it's one of 10 methodological principles in task-based language teaching. Focus on form is a methodological principle, but it is realized in the classroom at the teacher's discretion, because the teachers know best what they're teaching at the time, who the students are, and so forth, in potentially an infinite number of pedagogic procedures. So for example, if you accept the methodological principle, provide negative feedback, or focus on form, or encourage inductive chunk learning, or etc., there's 10 of these things, it doesn't tell you or limit you to any particular pedagogic procedure for realizing that methodological principle. Now, if it's a very simple grammatical distinction, say a word order, something that learners get very quickly anyway, there's nothing wrong, in my view anyway, there's nothing wrong with using explicit negative feedback if they're saying, if they got the wrong word order, say adjectives after the noun in English, nothing wrong with just getting everybody's attention and say, the apple red? And they say yes, and you say no. And so this is explicit negative feedback, but it's a big leap from there, and not a leap I have ever made, to say that therefore any kind of explicit language teaching can and does use focus on form. Remember, other conditions to merit the term focus on form is that the lesson must be fundamentally communicative, and that these are just temporary, brief switches of attention to language as object. So I found that there were some things that I definitely disagreed with in Rod's piece yesterday, but it would take me an article about the same length as his to respond to all the charges. I will do so. So, condition 1, this is with explicit stuff, works, provided the outcome measures are like the treatments, unspeeded and discrete point. But the size of the learning task makes it an unviable solution in the long run. Condition 2 has been shown to work quite well too. Think of the statistical meta-analysis by Norris and Ortega, by Gu, Granena et al. The basic result is that focus on form does slightly poorer in most of the studies. There have been a lot of studies of this now, focus on forms versus focus on forms. It does slightly poorer than focus on forms, but not statistically so. And given that most of the studies are short-term, targeting very simple grammar, otherwise the researcher would lose control, that of course favors explicit learning, because that's the kind of stuff you can learn easily explicitly. But of course, what about all the hard stuff? I mean, my colleague Robert de Keyser, who's a big advocate of skill acquisition theory, perhaps the leading one in the world, he recognized back in 2007 that this stuff is only relevant for learners in a classroom setting with high language learning aptitude for simple structures. So that leaves an awful lot of people, because we're not all in Lake Wobegon where everybody's above average, it leaves all the average and low aptitude people, it leaves all the language that isn't simple, and it leaves naturalistic acquirers, or hybrid acquirers, mixed acquirers, you could call them, out of the equation. So I don't think it's reasonable just to continue to say, well, explicit is better than implicit. In fact, those studies, I'm going to argue, are really irrelevant these days. But in fact, when they have been compared, focus on form has been shown to do as well as focus on forms, in the sense of not statistically significantly worse. How am I doing on time? 10 past 6. What did we actually start at? I have until 6:20. We're in trouble, folks. I blame Rod for this, because he caused me to have a digression.
Sorry.
Yeah. Now, noticing can facilitate, this is the outcome of condition 1 and some condition 2 studies. Noticing can facilitate incidental learning in several ways. First, it can encourage selective attention to non-salient, non-meaning-bearing, communicative, redundant, complex, fragile linguistic features that might otherwise go unnoticed or undetected for a long time, perhaps even permanently. Second, it can facilitate perception of mismatches between the input and deviant learn output, so-called noticing the gap. Third, and most importantly, as Nick Ellis proposes, it can modify entrenched automatic L1 processing routines, thereby altering the way subsequent L2 input is processed. as embodied in the tallying hypothesis of Nick's, once a new form or structure has been noticed and a first representation of it established in long-term memory, detection can take over, so without conscious awareness, detection can take over as subsequent input is parsed implicitly. The initial representation in long-term memory brought about by the instructional intervention functions as a selective cue and primes the learner to attend to and perceive subsequent instances in the input during implicit processing. It is analogous to setting a shortwave radio dial to a new frequency. The listener has to pay close attention to the initial crackling reception. Once the radio is tuned to the new frequency, however, he or she can sit back, relax, and listen to the broadcast with minimal effort. Nick Ellis identifies what he calls, quote, the general principle of explicit learning in SLA. Changing the cues that learners focus on in their language processing changes what their implicit learning processes tune. So far, so good. Instruction is successful, which recruits temporary episodes of intentional learning as an aid to subsequent implicit processing. The trickier question for ISLA researchers to answer is whether the same changes to the cues to which learners attend implicitly can be achieved without intentional learning and noticing, even when the noticing is achieved not by explicit instruction, but by a relatively unobtrusive focus on form. Instead of intentional learning and conscious noticing, can cue changes be achieved and blocking overcome by condition 3, by less intrusively enhanced, so if you didn't like focus on form, you're certainly not going to like this, by even less intrusively enhanced incidental learning and unconscious detection, in other words, by perception without awareness. Also, can the same less intrusive enhancements work for the acquisition of L2 targets, such as new vocabulary items and collocations, which are handled by instance learning? If people ask, I'll be happy to illustrate with some studies of that in the second session. It is not just that the jury is still out on both questions, there's hardly any evidence on which a jury could base a decision. Now, some of you may ask, with textbook writers and publishers no doubt leading the protest, why is this of interest? If either explicit instruction, or if that is ruled out for lack of time and the size of the learning task, focus on form and noticing can do the job. There are several reasons, but an obvious one is that extreme measures in many fields, not just ours, can cause collateral damage worse than the problems they are designed to solve. Chemotherapy, for example, works for some patients and for some cancers, if caught early enough, but can be so devastating that it kills the patient, not just the cancerous cells. Consequently, a major search is now underway in bioengineering research programs for less intrusive, individually targeted cancer treatments, for example, by modifying the drugs so that they seek out and only latch onto the walls of cancerous cells in a particular internal organ, leaving the rest of the body unharmed. And as I noticed earlier on, there's growing interest and use internationally of such programs as Immersion, TBLT, and CLIL, in which the principal focus is the non-linguistic syllabus, with the L2 being learned incidentally and occasionally intentionally through being used communicatively as the medium, not the object of instruction. I'm so sorry about this. It's really, must be picking up Italian or something, you know. Brian Lister was talking about this a lot yesterday. Explicit instruction and a focus on language as object may turn out to be more efficient for some language learning details, but like massive doses of chemotherapy, it disrupts the main focus of such programs, diverting teachers' and students' attention away from crucial non-linguistic syllabus content. Focus on form, with its temporary brief switches to intentional language learning during otherwise communicative lessons, is a major improvement in this regard. If they work, less intrusively enhanced incidental learning and detection would be better still for the same reasons. Again, therefore, there are three possible conditions to be compared, not necessarily all three in the same study, and there they are. I'll let you read those at your leisure. Due to time constraints, which are pressing now, I can only briefly illustrate with one of the areas I would prioritize. As I say, I have a second one later if you're interested. It is motivated by the work of the Michigan group on resetting L1 parameters and dealing with blocking. Since I know of no single study that includes even two, let alone all three relevant conditions, the studies I will mention in a moment exemplify just one component of the kinds of comparisons I think are needed. The studies are complex, so for lack of time I will have to omit important details. A second area involves there's the lexical stuff, which I'll deal with later. So let's look at a couple of studies of this first issue. Nick Ellis, to appear, cautions that despite their frequency, even when input is unlimited, a combination of factors works against purely implicit successful adult learning of L2 grammatical functors. low saliency, redundancy, low contingency of form-function mappings, learned attentional biases, and L1 tuned processing. It's a huge set of things to overcome. Adverbs, conversely, are salient, simple, and regular, which makes them more learnable in a new language. One way of enhancing incidental learning is to speed up detection of the cues that aid in resetting L1 parameters, thereby dealing with some of the negative effects of learned attention and blocking. Some sort of externally induced attention to form may be necessary, and a very interesting example of condition 1 work of this kind, and simultaneously of the advantages brought about by the use of eye tracking, is a recent study by Meredith Valentin and Nick Ellis. Now this is that 2015 SLA study. They did another one this morning, which I missed because of the SLA editorial board meeting, and I understand it was also excellent. So I'm talking not about the one at this conference, but about the one in 2015. Building on and replicating findings in studies by Ellis and Nuria Sagara, Tindron, Valentin, and Ellis conducted a series of 3 experiments to compare the effectiveness of explicit procedures, in other words, focus on forms, not focus on form as they say erroneously in the article. That's the only bad part about it. For drawing the attention of 320 English native speakers to morphological cues for tense marking in Latin, with adverbs the blocking item. The explicit nature of the interventions made it a test of condition 1, in other words. There were 3 treatments in the first experiment. Verb grammar instruction consisted of brief computer-delivered metalinguistic instruction on Latin tense and morphology prior to exposure. 2, verb salience through textual enhancement saw the target verb inflections visually highlighted, bolded, and in red during exposure. Verb pre-training involved an extra pre-exposure phase during which participants received practice in translating isolated Latin verb forms into English. So this is extreme focus on forms, isolated translations and so forth, metalinguistic information. The forms were isolated so that the morphology was the only cue to meaning and not confounded with the potentially more salient adverb cues in continuous text. All 3 treatments produced superior learning of verbal morphology for both comprehension and production to that of a control group exposed equally to both morphological and adverbial markers together. Given that their first language is English, the control group conversely performed as expected, learning more salient Latin adverbial markers better than the corresponding morphology. In the second experiment, eye tracking data on a subsample of 66 of the participants in the first study showed that participants in all 3 treatment groups attended to the verb forms more and for longer periods than those in the control group during online processing. Now they have a third experiment with Chinese learners, but I'm going to skip that because I'm running out of time. The eye tracker data showed that, notice how again a new technology is closely linked to the kind of research that's being done now and how valuable it is. The eye tracker data showed that all 3 treatment groups attended more than the control groups to morphological cues, and that the amount of time participants allocated to the verb and adverb cues correlated positively with the use of those cues in the comprehension and production post-tests. Control group participants fixated on both cues during early trials, but gradually attended more to the simple and more salient adverbs. Like the previous studies by Ellis and Sagara, this set of 3 experiments supports Nick Ellis's claim that explicit attention to form retunes learner attention for subsequent implicit input processing, with new L2 cues strengthened by each new implicit encounter. This is impressive, but notice how explicit, at its extreme end of explicit instruction, that was used to achieve those results. Now there's another study which I'm also skipping by Cho and Reinders, which is relevant here. I'm just going to focus, and this will be the last thing I really deal with, on a second exemplary study, which is a sort of a condition 3 type study. There's actually been 2 more at this conference that I've seen. But I haven't got time to summarize them because I've only just heard them myself. This is I think, just an excellent study by Godfroid, 2016. Godfroid compared learning by 38 upper intermediate American college students of a complex L2 feature, vowel-changing allomorphy on strong verbs in German through a computer-delivered input flood. So we're not talking about explicit instruction, metalinguistic statements, 10,000 volts out of the fingernails here. This is very oblique enhancement of incidental learning. This is what I'm looking for in condition 3. And as you compare those students, we got the input flood with 32 students in a control group and a second control group of 21 German native speakers. In the training phase, one of 2 pictures was matched with 144 orally presented simple German sentences containing a total of 172 tokens, a mix of weak verbs and 12 different strong verb types in first and third person singular present tense. Only the third person strong forms involved a vowel change. All sentences followed SVO word order. The two potential agents pictured in each case were either both male or both female, making the verb the first reliable cue to the correct choice of picture. In the assessment phase that followed, the verb, therefore, was the point from which reaction times were measured, participants being told to choose their answer as fast as they could, not waiting until they had finished hearing the complete sentence. Comprehension scores, correct picture sentence matchings, constituted evidence that participants had stayed on task, with incidental learning the main process. There were 3 assessment blocks, each containing 24 sentences. The first, pre-violation control block, consisted of grammatical sentences. The verbs in the second violation block had not undergone the required vowel change, so the sentences were ungrammatical. The third block, containing only grammatical sentences again, served as a second post-violation control block. Sentences in the 3 assessment blocks only contained strong verbs in third person singular or requiring a vowel change. Participants' sensitivity to the grammatical violations in the second block was measured by their slower reaction times when they encountered those ungrammatical verb forms. There were 2 outcome measures: controlled oral production as a measure of explicit knowledge, and word monitoring, which Granena 2013 and Suzuki and De Keyser 2015 have proposed as a valid measure of implicit knowledge. These were administered as pre- and post-tests of explicit and implicit knowledge of the target rule, respectively. Pre- to post-test improvements observed in the treatment group members' grammatical sensitivity on the word monitoring task could potentially reflect growth in their implicit knowledge of the target structure, and that's the goal. An individual debriefing interview was used to assess awareness of whether participants had learned, specifically whether they reported having heard ungrammatical verbs in the training or assessment tasks. Statistical analysis showed that both the German native speaker controls and the unaware treatment group participants had slower reaction times for the ungrammatical sentences. A growing number of researchers in recent years have reported implicit learning of grammar and semantics in studies using artificial or semi-artificial languages. The fact that Godfroid's study used a natural language, German, and a natural linguistic phenomenon within German, vowel changing allomorphia on strong verbs, is important for its ecological validity. Replicating findings by Leuven and Williams, Godfroid's results showed changes in unaware learners' performance during an input flood, the slower reaction times, and afterwards, scores on the word monitoring task. The unaware learners had preferred regularized strong verb choices on the verb monitoring pretest, so the grammatical sensitivity they displayed by the significant slowdown in their reaction times with respect to the ungrammatical strong verbs on the violation block, and then again on the word monitoring post-test, suggests that implicit learning as a result of implicit instruction. The fact that the sensitivity carried over to untrained verbs as well indicates implicit system learning, not merely learning of individual items. So the Sintron, summarizing, the Sintron, Valentin, and Ellis study demonstrate the success of an explicit focus on forms intervention in resetting L1 parameters and dealing with blocking, condition 1. Cho and Reinders was a condition 3 study, but I didn't have time to go through it. The Godfroid study shows the potential of far less intrusive interventions, so condition 3, for developing command of tricky areas of L2 grammatical knowledge with transfer to new items in both cases. In Godfroid's study, implicit learning resulted from an increase in the salience of the target feature achieved simply by raising its frequency in the input, not by any additional changes such as unusual stress or increased volume, much less any explicit treatment. It demonstrates the feasibility of developing implicit knowledge, implicit learning, the goal, through an enhancement of incidental learning that was minimal and oblique. The 3 studies address somewhat different research questions, different linguistic targets, use different research methods, so they're not strictly comparable. But they do give some indication of what I think is needed next. ATI studies involving modified random assignment, blocking on aptitudes for explicit and implicit language learning aptitude, with between-group comparisons of 2 or ideally all 3 treatments of different levels of explicitness within the same study, those 3 conditions. As I mentioned earlier, a second area of testing involves the same three conditions for enhancing incidental learning and the speeding up of detection of new forms and input, easily illustrated by work on the learning of lexical items and collocations. I'll be happy to describe some relevant studies of that afterwards. I want to be clear, I think the Sintron, Valentin, and Ellis study is an excellent study. Excellent study. It's just that it illustrates the explicit end of the continuum. The Godfroid study, I think, is an excellent study, and it illustrates the other end of the continuum. Why, to conclude, would we be interested again? Well, the majority of the world's language learners, remember, require a functional command of the language. and they need to be able to use it for communication, not just know about it. For them, the primary goal of instruction is to develop implicit knowledge. However, time constraints and the sheer size of the learning task preclude exclusive reliance on either intentional or incidental learning. As a result, what we were looking for is not a hybrid. It's no good just saying, well, let's do some of each, because that's psycholinguistically incoherent. But rather, we need to find out how little intrusion we can get away with and still achieve our goals. Now, we can't risk the learners in this. If the enhanced incidental learning does not deliver, then we have to move back up the continuum to focus on form, hopefully never again to, PPP, focus on forms and all that stuff. And I really don't think, I think the evidence is pretty much in on that already. Short-term ISLA studies, often lasting only a few hours, purporting to show an advantage for explicit over implicit grammar, or focus on forms over focus on form, or overt negative feedback over recasts, are of only limited interest. Aside from their frequent methodological problems and lack of ecological validity, they're missing the point. The use of unnecessary measures to do anything is intellectually unsatisfying. In the world of rock climbing, for example, very difficult routes are often first put up by pairs of climbers, one belaying the other using a variety of artificial aids, hooks, copperheads, nuts, cumming devices, ascenders, ropes, pulleys, and pitons hammered into the rock face. Subsequently, individual climbers may attempt to solo the route, still using artificial aids. Finally, along come the experts, the top dogs. They may free the climb, knocking out all the previous climbers' artificial aids as they ascend. As you can imagine, freeing climbs is not for the faint-hearted, and it is important to make sure that condition 3 would not endanger our learners either. The point is that I believe that a focus of ISLA research is to find out how many of the artificial aids we can get rid of. We need to free instruction so that learners are able to concentrate on the tasks that they're learning how to do, the content subjects that they're learning in immersion or CLIL programs, for example, while learning the language. And of course, the collateral damage from explicit focus on forms is immense to those sorts of things. Now, I could go on a lot more about this, but because of time, I must stop now in deference to our organizers. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Long, and thank you, everybody.